Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today we're going to be looking at a grammar topic that I know could be really tricky for French learners.
Yes, it's something that a lot of people struggle with.
Exactly. And I know a lot of you out there are using Pronunciator to study French.
Right.
We thought we'd pick a topic from the apps library module and really go deep on it, you know?
Yeah, get into all the details and the nuances.
Exactly. So the topic today is connaître and savoir.
The two verbs that mean to know.
Yes, which is super confusing.
It is very confusing.
But by the end of this deep dive, you'll be able to use them both perfectly and confidently.
Yeah, that's the goal.
All right, so where should we even start with this?
Well, the first thing to understand is that connaître and savoir express different types of knowing.
Okay, so it's not just that they're like synonyms.
No, definitely not.
Okay.
Connaître is about familiarity with someone or something, like a person, a place, or a thing.
Sure.
So, for example, if you've met someone named Marie, you would say, Je connais Marie. Okay, so it's for people.
Exactly.
So then what about places?
Same thing. If you've been to Paris, you would say, Je connais Paris.
Okay, I see. So it's for people and places.
Yes, and things too.
Right.
Like, if you're familiar with a certain book, you could say, Je connais ce livre.
All right, so anything you've had like a personal experience with.
Yeah, exactly. It's about knowing something or someone because you've encountered them before.
Got it. Okay, so then what about savoir?
So savoir, that's more about knowledge of facts, information, or skills.
Okay, so like if I know the date.
Yeah, exactly. You'd say, je sais la date.
Okay, or if I know how to swim.
Exactly.
Je sais nager.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So connaître is for people, places, and things you're familiar with. And savoir is for facts, information, skills, things like that.
Exactly.
So it's not just about knowing something. It's about what kind of knowing it is.
Precisely.
That's really helpful. Okay,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we've got the basic difference down, but I'm sure it gets a bit more complicated than that.
Oh, it does. There are some nuances.
Like what?
Well, for example, you can use connaître to express different levels of familiarity.
Okay, how does that work?
So if you say, Je connais Marie, it means you know Marie, but maybe not very well. But if you say, Je connais bien Marie, it means you know her well.
So you add bien to mean like really well?
Exactly. It emphasizes the closeness of the relationship.
That makes sense. And you can do that with places too, right?
Of course, if you say, Je connais bien Paris, it means you're very familiar with the city.
Okay, so it works with both people and places.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right.
Yeah.
What other nuances are there?
Well, let's go back to savoir for a minute.
Okay.
If you think about it, knowing a fact is different from just being familiar with something.
Right. Like I might know of a certain historical event, but I wouldn't necessarily say I know it.
Exactly. So in that case, you would use savoir to say you know the fact.
Okay, so like, je sais que la Révolution française a eu lieu en 1789.
Perfect. That's a great example.
Okay, cool. So I'm starting to see the difference.
Yeah. And this distinction is really important for clear communication.
I bet if you use the wrong verb, people will be like, what?
They might be confused or think you sound a little strange.
That makes sense.
Oh.
Okay, so we've talked about knowing people and places with connaître and knowing facts and information with savoir.
Yes.
What about skills?
Yes. That's another important use of savoir.
Okay, so how does that work?
You use savoir plus an infinitive verb to express your ability to do something.
Oh, so like, je sais parler français.
Exactly. That means you can speak French.
Okay, cool. I'm going to use that one a lot.
I'm sure you will.
And it works for other skills too, right? Like, je sais jouer du piano.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm really starting to feel more confident with these verbs now.
That's great to hear.
But I have to ask, what about when you don't know something?
Good question. That's where negation comes in.
Okay.
You use ne pas connaître and ne pas savoir to express a lack of familiarity or knowledge.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. If you want to say, I don't know this song, you would say, Je ne connais pas cette chanson.
Je ne connais pas cette chanson.
Exactly.
Okay, and why do you use connaître in that case?
Because it's about familiarity with the song itself. You're not saying you don't know the lyrics or the melody.
Right, it's like, I haven't encountered the song before.
Exactly.
Okay, I get it. So then what about if I want to say, I don't know how to play the piano?
Then you would use ne pas savoir because playing the piano is a skill.
Okay, so je ne sais pas jouer du piano.
Perfect.
All right, so ne pas connaître for things I'm not familiar with.
Yes.
And ne pas savoir for things I don't know how to do.
Exactly.
This is making so much more sense now.
I'm glad to hear it.
But I have a feeling there's even more to it than this.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot more we can explore.
Okay, well, I'm ready to dive even deeper.
Great. Then let's move on to talking about how connaître and savoir work in different tenses.
Ooh, tenses. That's always fun.
It can be.
I'm ready for the challenge.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so we've talked about connaître and savoir in the present tense.
Right.
But how about other tenses like the past?
Oh, yeah, that's got to be more complicated.
Well, it can be, but if you remember those boxes we talked about.
People and places versus facts and skills.
Exactly. Those boxes can still help you choose the right verb in the past.
Okay, that's good to know. So how does it work?
Well, in French, you have two main past tenses, the imparfait and the passé composé.
Yeah, I know those.
And both of them can be used with connaître and savoir.
Okay, but how do you know which one to use?
It depends on what you want to emphasize.
Okay, listening.
The imparfait is used for actions or states that were ongoing or habitual in the past.
Okay.
So, for example, if you want to say you knew someone when you were a child, you would use the imparfait with connaître.
Okay, so like, je connaissais Marie quand j'étais petit.
Exactly. That means you knew Marie continuously during your childhood.
Okay.
Whereas the passé composé is used for completed actions in the past. So if you want to say you learned how to swim last summer, you would use the passé composé with savoir.
Okay, so j'ai appris à nager l'été dernier.
Perfect. You learned the skill at a specific point in time, and now you have it.
Got it. So imparfait for ongoing knowing in the past, and passé composé for completed actions.
Exactly.
That's pretty clear, actually.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
But I have a feeling there are some tricky cases, right?
Oh, there are always tricky cases.
Like what?
Well, sometimes you might be talking about a fact that you knew in the past, but you don't necessarily remember it now.
Okay.
In that case, you would still use the passé composé with savoir.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine you were asked a question in a quiz, and you knew the answer at the time, but now you've forgotten it.
Okay.
You would say, j'ai su la réponse, even though you don't remember it anymore.
J'ai su la réponse.
Yeah.
Okay, so even though knowing the answer was temporary, you still use passé composé because it was a completed action.
Exactly. You knew the answer at a specific point in the past.
That makes sense. Okay. So far, we've been talking about positive sentences, but what about negative sentences in the past?
Ah, yes, that's another interesting point.
Okay. How does that work?
Well, the same rules apply for choosing between connaître and savoir.
Okay.
But you use the imparfait or the passé composé of the negative form.
So, ne pas connaître or ne pas savoir.
Exactly.
Okay. Can you give me some examples?
Sure. If you want to say you didn't know a certain city when you were younger, you would use the imparfait of ne pas connaître.
So, je ne connaissais pas cette ville quand j'étais jeune.
Perfect. That means you were not familiar with the city during that time.
Okay. And what about if I want to say I didn't know how to drive until last year?
Then you would use the passé composé of ne pas savoir because learning to drive is a skill.
All right. So, je n'ai pas su conduire avant l'année dernière.
You got it. You acquired the skill at a specific point in the past.
This is really starting to come together now.
I'm glad to hear it.
But before we move on, can we talk about the subjunctive mood?
Oh, the subjunctive? Yes, we can touch on that.
I know it's a bit of a scary topic.
It can be, but it's important to understand how it works with connaître and savoir.
Okay, so how does it work?
Well, the subjunctive is used to express doubt, uncertainty, or hypothetical situations.
Right.
And both connaître and savoir can be used in the subjunctive, but their usage depends on the context.
Okay, can you give me some examples?
Sure. Imagine you see someone at a party who looks familiar, but you're not sure if you know them.
Okay.
You might say, il me semble que je connais cette personne, which means, it seems like I know this person.
Ah, so you're using the subjunctive with connaître because you're not certain.
Exactly. You're expressing a doubt.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about with savoir?
Well, let's say you're hoping that your friend knows how to cook a certain dish.
Okay.
You could say, j'espère qu'il sache cuisiner ce plat, which means, I hope he knows how to cook this dish.
So again, you're using the subjunctive because you're not sure if he knows how to cook it.
Precisely, you're expressing a hope or a wish.
Okay, I see how it works now.
Good. So the subjunctive can add a layer of nuance to your sentences with connaître and savoir.
Yeah, it's like you're saying you're not 100% sure.
Exactly.
This is really helpful. I feel like I'm getting a much deeper understanding of these verbs.
That's the goal.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've talked about the basic difference between connaître and savoir.
Yes.
And how they work in different tenses and even in the subjunctive mood.
Mm-hmm.
I think our listeners are ready to start using these verbs like pros.
I hope so.
But before we wrap up, I want to talk about some common mistakes that people make with these verbs.
Oh, yes, that's important.
What are some of the most common ones?
Well, one common mistake is using savoir when you should use connaître.
Okay, how does that happen?
Sometimes people try to use savoir to talk about familiarity with things when they should really be using connaître.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, you wouldn't say je sais ce livre for I know this book.
Right, you'd say je connais ce livre.
Exactly, because it's about familiarity with the book as an object.
Not about knowing the contents.
Precise.
Okay, I see. And what other mistakes do people make?
Another common one is using connaître when you should use a different verb altogether.
Ooh, interesting. Like what?
Well, some people try to use je connais le français to mean I'm fluent in French.
But that's not quite right, is it?
No, it's not, because connaître is about being acquainted with French, not about mastering it.
Ah, I see. So what should you say instead?
You could say je maîtrise le français or je parle couramment français.
Okay, so connaître is for knowing about something, but not necessarily being an expert.
Exactly.
All right, I'm making a note of that one.
Good.
So are there any other common mistakes we should warn our listeners about?
Well, one more thing to keep in mind is that French has a lot of idioms and expressions that use connaître and savoir.
Oh, yeah. Idioms, those can be tricky.
They can be, but they're also really fun.
Yeah, they add so much color to the language.
Exactly, and they can also help you understand the nuances of connaître and savoir.
Okay, so do you have any examples?
Sure. One common idiom with connaître is en connaître un rayon sur quelque chose.
What does that mean?
It literally translates to know a ray about something, but it really means to know a lot about something.
Ah, so it's like being an expert.
Exactly.
That's cool. And what about an idiom with savoir?
Well, one that comes to mind is avoir su, which means to have known.
Okay, and how is that used?
It's often used to express regret or a missed opportunity.
Oh, like if I had known, I would have gone.
Exactly. Si j'avais su, j'y serais allé.
That's a good one. I'm going to try to remember that.
I'm sure you will.
So these idioms really show how connaître and savoir are used in everyday French.
Absolutely. They give you a glimpse into the richness of the language.
This has been so helpful. I feel like I've learned so much today.
I'm glad to hear that.
And I think our listeners are well on their way to mastering connaître and savoir.
I hope so.
So what should we talk about next time?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground on connaître and savoir, but there's always more to learn. So I think it's time to move on to a new topic.
Okay, sounds good. What do you have in mind?
Well, how about we tackle another tricky grammar point that often trips up French learners?
Ooh, I like the sound of that.
Great! Then let's dive into the world of the subjunctive mood.
It's subjunctive. Oh, boy.
Don't worry, we'll break it down step by step and make it as painless as possible.
Okay, I'm trusting you.
All right, then see you next time for another deep dive into French grammar.
All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into connaître and savoir.
Yes, it's been quite a journey.
It really has. I feel like we've covered so much ground.
We have. We've gone from the basic meanings to all sorts of nuances.
Yeah, and I think our listeners are now well equipped to use these verbs correctly and confidently.
I hope so. That was the goal.
So as we bring this episode to a close, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
Well, I would say the most important thing is to keep practicing.
Of course, practice makes perfect, as they say.
Exactly. And the more you use connaître and savoir in real-life situations, the more natural they'll become.
That's true. It's one thing to understand the rules,
Right.
but it's another to actually use them.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Oh, yeah. Everyone makes mistakes.
It's part of the learning process.
Exactly. And that's how you learn and improve.
Precisely so. Keep practicing, keep experimenting, and keep having fun with French.
I love that. And for our listeners who are using Pronunciator,
Yes.
I think this deep dive has been a great complement to the app's lessons.
I agree. It's all about taking that knowledge and applying it in a more in-depth way.
So to everyone out there who's working towards that Connaître and Savoir certificate, keep up the great work.
You're doing awesome.
And remember, learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint.
Well said. It's all about consistency and perseverance.
Exactly. So keep at it and you'll get there.
And don't forget to enjoy the journey.
Yes, learning French should be fun and rewarding.
Absolutely. So keep exploring, keep discovering, and keep immersing yourself in the language.
Awesome. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this episode.
Agreed. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, merci beaucoup for tuning in.
À bientôt.
Au revoir, au revoir.